Hello everyone and welcome to EthicsTalkLIVE. It's been a while, I think, since we've been here in the Helsinki studio with our guests and with both of us, Anna, so really nice to be here.
Yes, this is awesome.
Yeah, so I think today's topic is something that we all have been thinking of recently. So how business can do the right thing in a turbulent world. And this is the name of the book that is written by Alison Taylor, which is kind of at the core of today's session. So Anna, would you like to share a bit more of?
Yeah, I don't know what to say, Nina, because somehow I feel so excited. It's such an honor to be able to host this Ethics Talk Live in the NBA headquarters, as we say, and with both Alison Taylor and Richard Bistrong here behind us. So we promise this will be an amazing hour. Those of you who do not know Alison and Richard, I do think it's very few of you who may not know them so well. Well, after this discussion, you will surely know them. Alison has recently written a book, so our discussion is going to be quite a lot around her amazing book. She's a professor at New York Stern School of Business. She's a director at Ethical Systems. She has an impressive career working with helping companies, organizations to basically do the right thing. And now she has distilled all of that into this amazing book. She's on a book tour throughout Europe, and we have managed to catch her here in Helsinki at the same time when Richard Bistrong is visiting as well. So this is such a treat. Richard, many of you know, he is really a fierce compliance advocate, bringing his experience from sort of being a bit of a compliance. I think I told him yesterday in an event, I said he was the one causing troubles and I was the one trying to solve troubles, not in the same organization though. But Richard's story is really from corruption to compliance, how a person can go from doing the wrong thing in really being a steward for right behaviors. And Richard is now driving that through his own business, being a consultant and traveling around the world, being an advocate, helping us in compliance to really understand how we can bring compliance practices throughout our organizations and making our compliance statements a reality. So with Richard and Alison here, Nina, is there anything else we should sort of say?
Probably just that, if you like this, these guys are not here for the first time, so you can check out the old recordings as well from our archive to hear Alison and Richard. And also, this is a chance for you to ask directly questions from these guests. So there is a chat, so just post your questions there and we'll make our best to input those to the conversation.
And so we will do this in a way where we have actually asked Richard to facilitate a discussion with Alison around her book. So Richard and Alison will have this discussion. At the same time, we do ask you to think about questions and so on. Me and Nina will follow that. And then we will leave some time for questions, and me and Nina will jump into the conversation before we end. But with that,
yeah, floor is yours.
Welcome.
Amazing. It's so fun to be here and to be with so many friends and to be having a wonderful time in Helsinki. Great to see you, not in New York for once.
Likewise. And I won't even share how long we've known each other because there's no need to date one another or date one another.
Longer than we want to admit.
Exactly. But what an honor and pleasure to interview Alison and to put a picture with the book. This is Higher Ground. How business can do the right thing in a turbulent world. It is a wonderful and significant book. This is the one that I've marked up and pretty much destroyed, and the one that you were so kind to sign for me in New York, I've preserved. That is for show. This one's to go. So, Alison, I guess the first question is, why did you write the book? Right? Did you see a gap in our corporate and global world that you thought there was missing?
It's such a great place to start. The very short answer, and then I'll give a longer answer. I was asked to write a business ethics book fit for the mid-21st century, fit for the 2020s. And I started thinking about this topic, and I started asking questions of what do we even mean by being an ethical business today? we have this old-fashioned idea, right, from Milton Friedman. You focus on shareholder value, you don't break the law. And that equates implicitly the idea of ethics with legal compliance. And in fact, many of us work in departments called ethics and compliance. But then I had this amazing experience, which I talk about in the introduction of the book, where I would go and interview ethics experts about the topic of ethics. And I thought it was fascinating that many of them would say, I try not to use that word. I try not to use the word ethics. It sounds punitive. It sounds judgmental. Actually, somebody said it last night at dinner that they preferred the word integrity to ethics. So I found that just as sort of fascinating way into the topic, that we no longer can really equate ethics with legal and compliance, both because of human behavior, both because, as we know, it's not just about rules, it's about principles, and also because, as a society, we are just as inclined today to see not caring about the environment or not having a good enough diversity strategy as being unethical, even though neither of those things are the remit of the compliance department. So I concluded that we don't really know anymore what we mean by being a good business or a bad business. To the degree we don't even have a common language to talk about what we're discussing. And so when I thought about naming the book, I was like, should I call it A New Approach to Business Ethics? Should I call it How to Be More Sustainable and Responsible? And I found that there was no common term that everyone could understand, which is why the book is called Higher Ground. So my position is that we don't know really as a society anymore what it means to be ethical. We're not really sure whose job this is in the company. We like, obviously, to talk about ethics and say we're the most wonderful ethical culture. But when it comes to actually building these ideas into structures and systems and incentives and norms and culture, that becomes a much harder challenge. And it's a much harder challenge for today's CEOs because the functions that they're used to delegating to now need to get much more aligned and need to think more holistically. And that's a very easy thing to say, very difficult thing to do.
Agreed. So given that, as you just described, Higher Ground is not it's not an ethics and compliance book per se, right? It's a much wider book and a higher book than that. But given that most of our audience, or a lot of our audience joining us today, do come from that ethics and compliance function. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to focus on some of those elements.
Yeah.
No, thank you. Okay, so right at the beginning, you share that doing the right thing is so much more demanding than it looks. Now, if I asked you that question even 2 years ago, like what should ethics and compliance leaders be thinking now that they might not have been thinking about even a few years ago?
Well, I mean, I think, and we're in Helsinki here, so we're sitting in the EU. I mean, the very, very obvious immediate answer is around the increasing regulation of ESG. Okay. And let me just kind of pick up on that and double click on it a little bit, because if we have the idea in a company that ethics and compliance deals with policies and procedures and third-party due diligence and investigations and managing the whistleblowing line, and the sustainability team deals with climate change and human rights and the commitments we make that are voluntary, and we talk about what we're doing and we talk about what a good business we are, then we have one group of people talking about the law and another group of people talking about going beyond the law. Now, when everything becomes a legal requirement, that division doesn't make sense anymore, maybe. And so a big theme I'm hearing at the moment is with the CSRD, with the CSDDD, with all these regulations about ESG disclosure, about supply chain oversight, there's this real new pressure, I think, on ethics and compliance officers to take a broader remit. And in fact, Anna has exactly this remit under her where she works. She doesn't just run ethics and compliance, she runs sustainability and integrity more broadly as well. And so Anna is sort of the model of something we call the emerging chief integrity officer.
Right.
And that is both a challenge, I think, for today's compliance officers who are already overstretched and trying to do far too much with far too little budget and are now really like, what? I need to take on this as well. At the same time, and maybe we can hear from Anna on this later, I think it's also this amazing opportunity to think about and reframe ethics from a more strategic dimension. And so to really get these questions up to the organizational level. So what kind of behavior are we incentivizing? And even questions like, what countries do we want to operate in? How are we going to operate? How are we going to manage all these societal pressures? So I see this as an incredible opportunity for ethics and compliance leaders to become more senior, to become more strategic, to become more high profile. But of course, opportunities always come with risks and always come with demands.
Okay, so we'll dig a little deeper into that. You share how companies can adapt to this new ethics landscape, which I think you just well described, by taking simple steps to avoid mixed messaging on one hand and one-size-fits-all thinking on the other. Help. What are some of the simple steps?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing, which I make a very, very strong case for in the book, is that we have tended, and I think this is highly understandable given the network of increasingly contradictory legal expectations across jurisdictions, we've tended to think more is more. More rules, more processes, more policies and procedures. Oh, that happened. We hadn't anticipated that. Now we need a rule. Now we need a policy. More is more is more. And then, I've just described this landscape where now we're expected to have ESG as well. And so I think there's this kind of real danger of scope creep. There's this real danger of incoherence. And what we're really saying implicitly here, right, is we're expecting human beings who work in the organization to know all these rules, to memorize all these rules, to know how to apply these rules, to know where to go for help. And I speak to a lot of people in the classroom. They don't even know what the code of conduct says. They don't know where to find it. They don't know if they've got a problem. They don't know who they're supposed to report to. They don't know the hotline number. And so I think we're putting very often a very heavy cognitive burden. Cass Sunstein calls this sludge. Like we're creating a lot of sludge and we're creating a lot of process. And I think we need to ask how effective any of that is. So a big part of what I argue is that corporations need to get much more comfortable with saying employees have responsibility to use their judgment, to raise concerns when they have concerns, and to think in terms of principles rather than memorizing rules. And for that, we need a much more broad and comprehensive remit around speaking up. We need to treat this as going beyond more than identifying fraud and corruption and really providing a platform so employees can raise their voice and help shape culture. But also, we need better leaders who are willing to listen. I've been on this European book tour, and it's a question I'm asking all the time. And the question I ask all the time is, when was the last time you heard a CEO say, I don't know? And I think that's part of the problem, is that we've evolved to a leadership model of thinking we have to have all the answers and thinking we have to give all the rules. And I think the imperative now is to move to something more fluid, where we're really trying to treat this as a whole organization effort. That's very scary, I think. I mean, I'm suggesting we do something that seems difficult to pull off, but I think is essential if we're going to tackle any of this complexity.
Yeah. And I agree that CEO messaging, one of my clients, the CEO, started off saying, no one has all the answers. I don't have all the answers.
Perfect.
You can't have all the answers.
That's the perfect message we need from leaders today.
Agreed. So continuing on that thread, and there's a great Harvard Business Review article, aside from the role of the Chief Sustainability Officer, so maybe we can put that in the show notes, is another one on how we had this, it's a tongue twister, addition addiction.
Yes.
Right? We're adding to rules, policies, and procedures, but we're not thinking, if we're adding all this, is there something we can take out that's been antiquated?
Maybe we need to Marie Kondo our ethics efforts.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to, there's this idea, you add something, you've got to take something away. I try and have this approach so I don't buy any more shoes. I've got to get rid of a pair of shoes if I'm adding a pair of shoes. So, I think that's exactly it. I'm hearing a lot of people in ESG say this as well and start to talk about minimal viable reporting and how we can focus and how we can be more strategic in the face of all these demands to be more and more and more and more and do more and more and more and more. A lot of which I think, there's also a big industry of consultants and advisors that would like to make money off advising people to do more and more and more and more. There's Merle Kapteyn, very famous Dutch academic, has also written this paper about, saying that a lot of corporate responsibility and ethics efforts sort of imply that we've got to take on more and more responsibility and more tasks. And he says, the imperative is to say, here are the problems we're not going to try and solve, here are the problems we're not going to take on. And that is, with the best will in the world, a very, very difficult thing to do, because then you have stakeholders saying, well, I care about this thing, and why aren't you doing anything about this thing?
So it's interesting. It sounds like vocabulary is critical here, right? When we're talking about integrity as opposed to ethics. And one of the things that you share is, and on that thread of words are important, is moving us from a risk mentality to an impact mentality. And I heard right here on EthicsTalkLIVE, Michaela Ahlberg sharing how we should move from a risk mentality to a responsibility mentality. So again, let's go back to our ethics and compliance leaders and messaging. Like, what does that look like to shift even the narrative?
Yeah, and I think this, this question of risk versus impact and how we decide to prioritize is a difficult one. And my views are fairly, I'm not sure controversial is the right word, but I have a lot of criticisms of managing reputational risk in the book. And my perspective is really just that by the time a risk manifests, it's usually too late to do something about it. And the root cause of, in fact, of all the risks that face our business from an ethics and compliance perspective, certainly all the reputational risks that face us, the root cause is negative impacts on human beings. And so if you wait until the risk becomes a risk, you've likely waited too late. So let me give you a few examples to illustrate my point. Having a business that used tons and tons of plastic was not particularly risky until we became more aware through David Attenborough documentaries of the impact of ocean plastics, and then we need companies to do something about it. Operating in Russia was not, aside from the domestic obvious risk, was not particularly risky from a reputational standpoint until Putin invaded Ukraine. It was not particularly risky to invest in American pipelines until these enormous protests about the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016. And then suddenly there are all these protesters outside banks and so on. It was not actually particularly risky to be invested in Israel. And now there are protests in every university and every town I go to, and lots of people and employees as well pursuing divestment. So, and a lot of these risks, I think, feel unpredictable and feel unmanageable and feel like they're coming at leaders, like it's all coming at me, and I don't know how to anticipate what's happening here. So I think, and you can't, the world is changing too fast, but what you can do is say, as a business, what is my impact on society? What are my most profound negative externalities? Am I treating human beings with dignity and respect? And the other thing that you can do is say, here are my principles. Here are the set of principles about when and how I operate, when and how I choose to speak up, what I choose to prioritize. So at least if a new reputational risk comes, you've got some grounding, you've got some place to say you're acting on this or that basis, so that the people yelling at you and saying, do something about this, do something about that, you'll have an answer. And the final thing I will say about anchoring to reputational risk is that for a lot of the companies that I speak to who pay a lot of attention to reputational risk and have teams monitoring what is being said about their company on social media from minute to minute, you end up with governance by Twitter. You end up doing what Bud Light did, which is that if there is a backlash, if you face some kind of public pressure over something that you do believe in, you just apologize and you say, we didn't mean to upset anybody. And then you look as if you've got no direction and no values whatsoever. So I understand how threatening reputational risk is in this very image-dominated, hyper-transparent era. But I don't think the answer to that environment is to say, we'll just pay attention to everybody that's yelling at us on social media this week, and that'll be our principles. I think you've got to anchor on higher ground.
Well, I think you quote John Trimmer, who I think we're both a fan
Yes,
of, as saying
yes.
The risk that you see is the iceberg.
Exactly.
Right? That's not the biggest part of it.
That's such a good way to put it.
Yeah. So I'll turn it over to Anna and Nina for if there are any questions. And I forgot to thank you. I was so nervous starting the interview with Alison for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be back in the studio, and thank you for the invitation. So it's really such a pleasure to be back.
It's amazing to be here. What a joy.
Yeah, thanks for being here. We have actually one question. And well, Thomas is saying good morning from Chile. Good morning, Thomas.
Wow.
Yeah, so and everyone else, so feel free to post your questions here. But Kevin is asking here one question regarding actually the reporting lines that we discussed already. So there always seems to be controversy about reporting lines. Right now, ethics and compliance teams are already stressed and many under-resourced, yet there are calls for ESG initiatives, for example, to fall under the ESG remit. Any thoughts about structures and reporting?
So many thoughts. I suppose let me make a few kind of big picture comments. The first challenge I think that C-suites and CEOs are having today is that none of the problems we're describing fall neatly in either ethics and compliance or ESG or government relations or HR. I mean, it's not just ethics and compliance versus ESG. If we're talking about reputational pressures, if we're talking about culture and employee voice, if we're talking about the kind of commitments we make to solving climate change or addressing inequality, it's very hard these days for a CEO to say, that's your problem, Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer. And because we don't know what to do with many of these problems, we then, in fact, have this rash of let's create another chief. When a new problem comes up, we need a new chief. So we need a chief DEI officer. Now we need a chief AI officer. We need a chief happiness officer. In the pandemic, we needed a chief medical officer. And so I think there's this sort of knee-jerk response of, if a new problem comes up, let's create a new leader. And as you're pointing out, this can create huge incoherence, huge silos, and that kind of thing. I do think there is therefore an imperative to think holistically across the organization. I'd be really keen to hear how Anna runs this in a minute. It's easy to say, think holistically. I mean, it's a sort of jargon word almost. I think what's very, very difficult is how you need to get the senior leadership team in a room. You need to determine values, to determine commitments, to decide how and when you're going to operate. You need to be making decisions as a collective, because if you don't do that, you'll be perceived as a hypocrite. People talk a lot about corporate hypocrisy, and what they don't seem to understand is hypocrisy is the outcome of silos and lack of internal coordination. It's not the outcome of someone at the top being like, ha ha ha, I'm a total hypocrite. It's usually not by design. It's just trying to coordinate across these huge organizations. And so what we need is a forum where we have leadership alignment, but we need to also do that without diluting accountability. And that's fiendishly hard, because I think another trend in organizations is, we've all got a say in this decision, so nothing is quite our fault if something goes wrong. And so we need to somehow have this combination of holistic thinking and then accountability. You asked this very specific question about ESG and compliance. I mean, as ESG disclosures start to become legally mandated, start to need to be assured and accurate, I don't know that I would say that the compliance team needs to own all of this, but one thing they're extremely good at is process and accuracy of data and reporting to legal requirements. It seems somewhat of a no-brainer to me to have compliance oversee at least ESG reporting. And then it's a question of what else you're doing with that remit in the business. What is not acceptable, however, is to put ESG under the compliance officer with no budget and no additional people, because that is an absolutely enormous and highly complex topic. And I think you do need specialist expertise. I don't think it's enough to say ethics and compliance need to take this over without any prior knowledge or understanding. And a lot of these ideas of these two fields actually don't hang together very well. So more imperative for the organization to think about and manage some of those contradictions. But let's be clear, this is going to be a very, very, very complex situation, especially for European countries over the coming years.
Agreed. And Anna's been very generous in sharing the Gettinger journey in terms of this. And you quote Klaus Moosmeyer in terms of the Novartis journey. But in terms of how they brought these different issues together, as we shared yesterday, it's more the exception than the rule. Because I think Alison's right. It's like, okay, that will just fall under the ethics and compliance department. That's yours. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and for those who listening who don't know my remit, so I'm responsible in the executive team for sustainability, for legal, for ethics and compliance. I also have the assurance and audit, IP, very broad kind of umbrella. And I have been talking with my team very recently as well and said, hey, we have a unique possibility here. Because I hear in other organizations, there is a little bit of, finding the way, like what is legal doing here? Because it's legal requirements. Mm-hmm. What is ethics and compliance? And what is sustainability? And if it's reporting into different functions or a different executive, it can be a little bit hard to have those discussions. And I'm saying we have a brilliant opportunity because we have it all. So let's make sure we leverage the whole organization in working together to make sure we achieve what we want to achieve, because it's all about the outcome. What kind of impact do we want to have through our company on the society and environment, and how do we want to act? So I think that's the lens I think it's important to have. It really depends on your company, which business you are in, what do you need to do, what should you focus on, and maybe the organizational structures to support that will look a little bit different, because it is all about, as you were saying, Alison, it's about accountability for the whole organization. Yeah. So even if I started with saying I have ethics and compliance, sustainability and so on, I'm not responsible for that. For the sustainability transition agenda, it's not me. It's the whole management team, and each and every employee has a role to play in that. I see the role of myself and my team is to facilitate that, to make sure we are aware of things, we follow up, we report, but to really make it happen, it's not me. It's all of the 12,000 employees in the organization who's responsible for that. So I think it's important we find efficient way of working to support the organization, but it's also so important that we do not see this as, okay, who is responsible on the top, because everybody needs to understand this.
It's very interesting, and I hope this is an empowering conversation, because it's not, you have principles, right? We want this higher ground, but what are the structures to support that? Having a new chief doesn't mean you have the right structure. Giving a remit to an organization that's already overstressed and under-resourced, that's not the right structure. So, I find this to be a very empowering conversation that hopefully some of our ethics and compliance teams that are joining us today might need to have difficult discussions with their management about how to tackle this. So let's get back to the regulators.
Sure.
All right. So you talk about how compliance programs are often designed to deflect the regulators while paying little attention to how rules impact the human condition and behavior. So Alison, in some respects, we have to do both. We want a program that does inspire, that does influence, that does impact, but if there's a regulatory issue, it also has to be fit to size.
Of course.
Like, can we do both?
Well, I have this really kind of fascinating reflection here, which is that, yes, I think, and I think I'm sure no one on the line listening thinks that their job is only about pleasing the regulator, but there is certainly this idea, right, that, the original remit of compliance, the original understanding of client compliance is almost that you are the representative of the regulator or the representative of the public interest inside the company. And so, you have a very interesting kind of independence and responsibility as an ethics and compliance leader that is extremely stressful. Let's be clear. Your first responsibility is really to, the public interest and to the public good and that kind of thing. But of course, the way that the law has evolved is that if you do get into trouble, if one of your employees does something wrong, and you can say, here are policies and procedures, and here are our officials, and here are processes, and here are the due diligence reports, and we gave them all a chance, and we did everything right, you will have lower penalties. Right. So this is, I think, very often evolved into a sort of one-size-fits-all tick-box thing, and a new thing comes up, and we've got to have a new rule. And it can end up being this kind of, this one-size-fits-all kind of frame. I interview Hui Chen in the book, who, as people will know, was the compliance lead at the DOJ for a number of years. And she tells this story in the book of dealing with a company that had, I mean, it was some kind of fraud. And then the response was, well, we've got to train the whole organization on, credit card expenses and how not to commit fraud. And then she was like, well, how many people in the company have company credit cards? And the answer was about 100. And so she was like, it was sort of like this kind of lack of fitting to size, and she was so frustrated because she was like, what we actually want to see is something nuanced and specific and risk-based and built into the culture. And this is, by the way, every time I talk to a regulator, they're always really frustrated. They're like, we don't want this box ticking. We don't want all this stuff. What we want is a program that works. So there really seems like a disconnect here. And then the other kind of point I made in the question you asked is that and I made this point earlier in this conversation as well, like, none of us can remember that many rules.
Right.
And you end up in this point, you get in an elevator and there's a banana skin on the floor and you're like, well, is there a rule that says I need to pick up the banana skin? I mean, just pick up the damn banana skin. The principle is we don't want to have litter in the elevator, and so I think this kind of sludge, this creation of sludge, it's a problem because of the cognitive processes of employees. I think it can also become a problem because the employee is there like then going, this compliance officer is putting in place yet another process about some irrelevant thing that doesn't affect me. They're getting paid to waste my time and put me through all this stupid training, and I am therefore much less likely to go to them if I've actually got a problem. So we need somehow, I think, to have this less is more Marie Kondo approach. Yeah. In the face of regulations that seem to be more and more and more and more. But I don't know about you. Every regulator I talk to wants that.
Right.
So how to get there is the question.
Yeah, and there is a tsunami of regulations.
Yes.
Right? And people that are on the front lines of operations, whether it's the procurement or the commercial side, they cannot be expected to understand everyone. So I guess that's the higher values and the principles-based approach.
Yeah, no, but what we really want is for people to be able to ask questions and raise concerns if they're not sure and if it's a grey area. And the second thing we really want is for them to know where to go for help if they have a challenge or if they have a question. And the third thing we want is for them to speak up if they see something that they think is a problem that someone else is doing. And so that's pretty simple, actually. I'm not easy to say, simple to do, like most of what... wrong way around. Easy to say, very hard to do, as in common with everything that I'm saying. But I think you're on higher ground thinking about that than thinking what we need is yet another rule, and yet another process, yet another expense provision, etc.
Yeah, and I think that the most inspiring codes are the ones that start with, this code does not cover every possible interaction.
Exactly.
And things are going to be ambiguous and confusing. Here are the resources that we have to help you.
Exactly.
In the first paragraph.
In plain English and not in legalistic language.
There you go.
That's helpful as well.
So, digging a little deeper, you share that when companies do emphasize rules, punishment, and surveillance, that you're signaling distrust, that it's counterproductive. Can you share a little bit more why?
Yeah, I mean, I can. A big trend that started before the pandemic, but really dramatically escalated in the pandemic, is this trend of increasing employee surveillance. Many tools exist today. You can have your keystrokes tracked. Your employer can know when you're online and when you're offline, whether you're pausing to take a break. There are tools that can analyze the content of your emails to see if you're about to commit fraud. And again, in this kind of common theme that we're discussing of scope creep, once these tools exist, I think it's very, very hard for an ethics and compliance officer to say, well, I'm just not going to use them, especially in a highly regulated context like financial services. So suppose everyone's remote and they're trading on these electronic platforms, to say there is a tool that exists that might help me identify fraud and I'm not going to use it, is a really, really difficult thing to say, and a really good example of how this scope creep actually happens. But I had a student in my class this term who came to the end of the year to do his performance review, and it transpired that his employer had been tracking everything that he was doing and how much he was online and how hard he was working all year and was factoring that into his performance review. No one had told him. No one had told him that he was being surveilled. No one told him that was what was going on. And I think so a lot of this is because managers don't feel confident in their teams, don't feel confident in what their teams are doing. Another trend of the pandemic is, massive increase in meetings for their own sake. And so a lot of this is kind of bad management. I don't trust people. I don't trust people to sit at their desk, so I need a surveillance tool. But in fact, research from organizational psychology shows we're far more motivated if we feel trusted and if we have the power to meet our own goals and decide how we're going to get that work done. If we feel that someone is looking at us and breathing down our neck, that actually reduces motivation and very often it reduces performance. And it also may short circuit your own judgment and reasoning because someone else is monitoring me. So why do I need to have principles or think about speaking up? Because Big Brother's breathing down my neck, And so if we think about human behavior and how human beings actually like to work and like to be treated, I think we've got ourselves into a bit of a pickle on this one.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So, and it sounds like that could be a good time to take a pause and see if there are audience questions.
Yeah, we do have. Kevin has one more question here, actually regarding incentives, which I think is close to our hearts for all of us. So he's asking on the impact on incentives on ethics and compliance. So we know that most surveys indicate that ethics and compliance leaders are not involved in incentive and objective design, even though we all agree that this is what is important. So given the impact on incentives and their effects, is this problem even solvable?
I mean, I'm going to quote Richard, and I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but he says sales-based compensation schemes or incentive schemes are an absolute disaster for compliance. I mean, Richard is maybe one of the world's experts, not least because he's been through this, on this question. So, yeah, I mean, that is such a striking example of what I'm talking about with the need to think more holistically. Very, very common to have HR in combination with senior leadership design the incentives, and compliance is responsible for the rules. But, as we all know, it's not, and this goes to the kind of problems with the bad apple theory. If somebody is paying a bribe or somebody is committing fraud, it's likely not the thing that they wake up one day and they say today is a good day to pay a bribe. The issue is they're under pressure to hit their targets, or they're a long way away, or they feel like we're not going to find out, or no one's going to listen. And so, what I hear over and over again is not, that the company was permissive, but that there was an ethics and compliance officer saying, sign this code of conduct or you're going to get fired. And then there's a manager saying, grow your business 25% a year, and I don't want to hear it's too difficult in this corrupt environment. And if you don't do that, you're going to get fired. And so what is the pressure we're putting on the employee? What is the message the employee is getting? A lot of the time, the employee is going to be paying more attention to the manager who has control of their bonus and control of their salary than someone sitting in headquarters saying, don't break these rules. And so I absolutely believe that ethics and compliance should have a central role in designing incentives. But I also think we need to be very, very clear that designing incentives well is extremely difficult for some of the same reasons we've been talking about already. If you have too many metrics, too many goals, too many things, then that's very, very difficult, and it kind of causes a lot of sludge and causes a lot of complexity. And then if you do have an incentive around something like how you achieved a goal or your behavior, I think that is the way to go ultimately. But let's be very clear, then you're putting a lot of control on the discretion of the leader to evaluate their team fairly, and that's challenging. So there are all these trade-offs with incentive design, and not to mention skyrocketing CEO pay. So I think it's a very, very, very knotty area.
Naughty is right. And I think we could come back to Helsinki for a discussion on incentives, but I think for compliance leaders out there, think of them as a bottle of prescription medication. Just turn those incentives on the side, and there are scary side effects.
Yeah, exactly.
If it's a deadline, if it's a goal, if it's a reward, there's a side effect. And the question is, do compliance leaders, or are compliance leaders empowered to say, we're here to make sure that those side effects align with our principles and our goals and our values? So the last survey, as the question asked, for the most part, no. But again, hopefully, as we take a more holistic look, which means we have the structures in place to make sure that we're not, even with the best of intentions, pointing people in the wrong direction is important.
I mean, this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about why we need ethics leaders to have a more strategic senior remit. It's not enough to give them control of policies, procedures, rules, and reporting. Unless they have a role in incentives design, then they're always just going to be kind of cleaning up the mess afterwards. And so it's a really prime example of why I think we need to see a new model of ethics and compliance leaders that are not just about policies and procedures and rules and have this kind of, what I said a little while ago in this conversation, a broader strategic remit for the integrity of the organization.
Yeah. Otherwise, people are going to think they're in the middle of competing corporate objectives, right?
Which they frequently are.
Between the pressure to succeed and the pressure to comply, and now we have all these other pressures that you talked about.
Exactly.
All right, so you quote Anna in the book, and Anna shares, once you have a policy, risk framework, and training in place, that's where the hard work begins. So I'm going to open that up. Where does the hard work start? Or why does the hard work begin after you have all those things? I would think you would take a victory lap and the hard work is done.
Well, I'm going to give a short answer because, or try to give a short answer, because this is also something we could discuss at length. But the point that I'm making, and then maybe Alison has interpreted the quote differently, but the point I'm making is that, I mean, the ethics and compliance framework will trigger something in your organization. If it doesn't trigger anything, if you're just like policy training done, it's not effective. It is effective when you get new information, you have those discussions, you have the dilemmas surfaced. And that's hard, because I'm going to simplify and give an example. So you implement your framework, you put in place a business partner risk management framework, you start doing due diligence on not only your distributors, but JV partners, and you look a little bit more broadly, and you do that with a new methodology. And suddenly you find that, this business partner we've had in country X for the last 15 years maybe has some relations that we should question. How do you deal with that? That's what I'm meaning, because your ethics and compliance program will trigger information, and you have to deal with that information. Sometimes you have the information proactively, then it may impact a business decision in the future, but sometimes it's about the business decision that has been made, and you need to relate to that somehow.
Any thoughts about hard work?
I mean, I think I don't think I could put it better than Anna, which is why she's quoted in the book. But we've been talking a lot about culture change in the last few days, and I'm making arguments for culture change. I'm making arguments for rethinking how the company is in the world, and I think. I think the role of inertia can be really, really huge as well. We've been talking about how easy it is to change culture. And so you're also sort of fighting this inertia. You're talking about decisions that have been made. Yeah. You're talking very often about, very, very entrenched ways of being. And so if you're going to create, make a company or a culture more ethical, that requires changing things that you can't kind of come at them face on. They're much harder than changing rules. They're much harder than changing policies and reporting lines. And so I just found this quote so insightful, because it seems to express to me the challenge that we're all wrestling with, which is how we do really embed these ideas in an organization. And it's just this idea of how you integrate, I think is, again, another thing very easy to say where we very often get stuck.
And I think from another one of my favorite books, The Gray Zone by Anna and Michaela Ahlberg, is a sign of success in that hard work is friction in the business. So when your business leaders are maybe pushing back on some of this, like why should we discontinue this relationship, or why should we abandon this market? That's good news, isn't it? Because it means that they're taking it seriously and trying to have a balanced mindset between risk and success, as opposed to just figuring it out on their own, which might mean circumvention. So any more thoughts about friction?
Yeah, it's all about, I know, Richard, you like to talk about the difficult discussions, or both of you do, and that's, of course, the core of this all. If we are going to change organizations and behave better in the future and have a better impact, we need to have the difficult discussions. And for me, that friction, it's kind of a spark for having that discussion. It's a good thing, and I think once, for me personally, in my different roles that I've had, it's been very helpful to view it as a positive sign, because earlier on in my career, and when I was working at Telia, and that's what we write with Michaela about in the book, is that you somehow think I'm doing something wrong because people are disagreeing and it's becoming hard, and why can't we just have decent conversations? And then you need to train. And Nina is a fierce advocate of training your ethical muscles. That's when I'm quoting Nina on that. It's not something that's intuitive. It's hard work and it's consistent work. And it's also, if you stop training, the results disappear after a while. So you need to keep continuing doing that.
So let's unpack that metaphor. How does one build an ethical muscle?
Yeah, well, I think it's like a constant, like just when you go to the gym, if you stop, it's like it's something that it's kind of has to be there, like in the, like without adding it in somehow, like it would be something additional. But I think every day, even today, we've had a discussion with Anna. What is the right thing to do here? So stopping and thinking and learning and realizing that we're not perfect, any of us.
I think one of my clients said the more we question each other and the more we challenge trust and challenge integrity, we're not damaging it, we're building it, right, by asking the difficult questions. So, and especially maybe in environments where questioning success or questioning someone's integrity might be taken as an insult, isn't that a way that we can build trust and build an integrity?
I mean, to me, this is partly an argument for diversity, right?
Okay.
And people tend to say, well, there's all, and in fact, this data is queried, but, more diverse teams make more money. Well, more diverse teams, if people feel psychologically safe and confident to speak up, make better decisions. Because of everything we're talking about, you explore the question from all angles. You don't know everything. I don't know everything. We've all got different backgrounds. So if you can get those perspectives to the table and kick the conversation around, you will ultimately make a better decision. With that comes much harder work. And I think that's why a lot of diversity programs fail, because we don't understand that hard work, it'll be much less efficient to make a quick decision if everyone in the room has a different background, is from a different country, and has a different social identity and is bringing another perspective. More difficult than making a deal in the sauna if you're just a group of men. So, but that decision will be more robust, that will be more defensible, and then you will be able to move faster. So I think we do need to get comfortable with that idea of hard work. We need to get comfortable that conflict actually is a big advantage a lot of the time if it can be harnessed and leveraged properly. If you look at a lot of corporate scandals and, even something like the Challenger disaster, the problem was no one said anything.
Right.
I have this quote in my book from someone that was on the board when the Enron scandal broke, and Nell Minogue interviewed him and said, well, why didn't you say anything? And he said, well, no one else said anything. And so if we have that kind of culture, in the senior leadership team in the boardroom, which often goes along with a lack of diversity, we shouldn't be surprised when ethics scandals happen. So I think we need to get more comfortable with discomfort. We need to get more comfortable with surfacing these questions. We need to get more comfortable, especially as now a lot of what we need to consider is either a matter where the law says one thing here and one thing there, and we need to manage the inconsistency, or even more importantly, it is about the expectations of stakeholders and young people in particular, and young employees in particular, that we take stands on particular situations, or that we solve climate change instantly, or that we fight inequality and that kind of thing. And so if we're struggling to do all this with the rollout of policies and procedures, we're going to struggle a lot more when we're dealing with something fluid and amorphous like inclusion or like environmental justice or something like that. Yeah.
And we've been talking about that especially with respect to Gen Z, for example, that bringing them into program design early on in terms of ethics and compliance initiatives or campaigns, making them a part of that process, you're going to get much more awareness as to, this is why we do this.
Exactly.
And you're going to get greater buy-in.
Yeah, but that, again, we're advocating for a lot of hard work here, and we've also been hearing that everyone's kind of stretch, but yes, I think in a lot of organizations I work with right now, because there's been this rise of employee activism everywhere I go in Europe and the US, there are students protesting. I think we've in many organizations evolved into this sort of us versus them dynamic, where it's very easy for young employees and Gen Z to sit there and sort of say, well, they made a stupid decision and I'm going to petition them and I'm going to argue about it. Whereas if you actually say, okay, we're a company, here are the potential things we could prioritize. We can't prioritize them all. What kind of organization do you want to work in? What kind of values and principles do we want to have? Then it's their problem too.
Right.
Then you're also saying, well, yes, we could spend money on a lot of these initiatives, but we can't do that and give you a pay rise. So let's have a decision about how we're going to prioritize and where we're going to focus that says, yes, you've got rights to speak up. Yes, you've got rights to raise concerns with managers, but you've also got responsibilities. So, I think we've maybe gone too far in some ways with trying to please young people and give them everything that they want. And I'm all for them having rights. I'm all for them having voice. I'm all for them helping to address leadership blind spots. But with that, they've got to also take ownership of the decisions that we made.
That is such a great takeaway, is show them what's going on under the hood.
Yeah.
And realize there are trade-offs, realize there are not unlimited resources. Bring them into that conversation. You're going to slow things down, but you're going to have more diversity.
Yep.
And you're going to have more buy-in.
Yeah, and I think, as well, given how different the mindset is across generations in many organizations at the moment. We have boomers and Gen X and millennials and Gen Z, and they have such different worldviews. And so I think if you do this, and I'm again advocating for something that's quite hard work, but I think then you have something much more robust and resilient.
Yeah. So do I have time to ask Alison a final question?
Yes, you do.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I got 2 nods, so I'm going to go for it.
Yeah, and also we have some time for some more audience questions as well.
Yeah, if
Yes.
anyone wants to, it's a chance for the last question, so be fast.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah,
Okay.
go on.
And this will be a fast one. So you wind down your book and you share how when it comes to culture, curiosity, humility, and experimentation offer the best paths to success. And as you shared, and it's funny, I wasn't thinking of this in advance, but it's how we started. No one has all the answers in this environment. So Alison, how about some uplifting words of wisdom in how we can spark curiosity, humility, and experimentation?
Yeah, let me end then for a pitch, a heavy pitch for thinking about behavioral science and social psychology in the design of ethics programs. This is what I've been doing at Ethical Systems. And this really, really struck me at the beginning of the pandemic. Different companies, or rather when we all started coming back to work, different companies had different approaches to how we're going to work remotely. Some, particularly on Wall Street, said, you all got to be back in the office 5 days a week. Some said we're going to be entirely remote. The sensible leaders, in my opinion, said we are in uncharted territory and we don't know what works here. And so we need to have a year of experimentation. Let's try this. Let's try making everybody come in for a week a month. Let's say we've got to have everybody in for the same 3 days, and let's measure sentiment. Let's see what happens. Let's measure before and after, like a behavioral science experiment. And then I think if you do that, you end up with a better culture and you end up with a better approach that's more fit for purpose for your organization. And you don't have what's happened in most organizations that I can see, which is a lot of resentful employees that don't want to come in, or employees are now being told they're to work hybrid, and so they're all there kind of half the time in half empty offices, and no one knows what to do with the real estate, and we're all kind of trying to have everything at once. That is an outcome of leaders acting like they know what's going on in a completely unprecedented situation. So there's academic researchers, there's processes you can use that say measure behavior, do an intervention, measure what happens, look at the success. You could do that with ethics and compliance efforts. Again, I'm making this sound like hard work, but I actually think this would save a lot of time and money not doing things that actually don't work over the long run. So think about working with some academics. Klaus Moosmeyer at Novartis certainly has a lot of behavioral scientists in his team. I know many other companies that do. We had dinner in Barcelona last week with somebody that is an organizational psychologist working in the ethics team at Booking.com. So that that's a very, very, very exciting emerging area, not least because there's a lot of research showing us how to do all this better, and we need to embrace some of that research if we're going to take these efforts to the next level.
Yeah, and maybe we can even put a teaser in some of the links to the research in the show notes, because it's out there to read. So with that said, thank you so much, Alison. And I will turn it over to my Ethics and Integrity All-Stars, Anna and Nina. And this has been a wonderful interview. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Alison. I mean, this is so inspirational. I have a million ideas. Nina, do we have some questions still from the audience?
No, I don't know. Maybe my iPad is broken because I didn't get any questions. So.
No, so we don't have any more questions from the. So then I will ask a question, because we talked about dilemmas and difficult discussions, and Richard, this is something you wrote a paper on in Harvard Business Review just recently. Alison, you talk all about this. So some practical tips, because I still find it's difficult. Like, how do we have the difficult discussions in a constructive way?
Question for you. I think that question's for you.
I think that I'm going to go to Amy Edmondson's dangerous silence. In that we so often think if no one's calling us, no news means good news, right? So the question is, if we're not hearing from people that we should be hearing to prompt those difficult discussions, people who face high risk and volatile markets, are we calling them with lots of open-ended questions? How are things going? How can we help you? How can we better support your work? Now, speaking as former commercial Richard, the first time a compliance leader calls someone in the field to say, how are you doing? It's okay, what's the real reason for this call? But you know what? The second time you make that call and the third time you make that call, you're really showing a duty of concern for an individual. And I think that over time, because it's not a one and done situation, by having what I like to call proactive interventions, I think people will say, and I think the research supports this, you know what, I am struggling, and I am finding it difficult to succeed without sacrificing some of our values. So can you help me navigate this situation, because I'm struggling to do that. So I think to prompt these difficult discussions, we can't wait for them to come to us. We have to show that we're willing to be open-minded, to experiment, and to show the humility, like, we can't help you with the problems that you're not sharing with us. So we want to hear the struggles that you have.
Yeah. So it's all about the listening piece as well.
Listening up.
Yeah. Well, this was not a difficult discussion. It was an awesome discussion. Thank you so much for coming here to the studio on a late Friday afternoon. This has been a genuine, true pleasure. Nina, any final words from your side?
Well, yeah, of course. Big thanks for being in Finland, and Alison, thank you for writing the book. I just loved it, and I think that the part I love most is how you're beginning. That it's kind of like okay to be confused. We don't say this too often, and many times compliance people are perceived in the organization as they would know everything and as they would be above you, kind of saying what is the right thing to do. But we can breathe and have this conversation to find out together how we can become better and more ethical and sustainable individuals and organizations. Amen.
Love it. I love that. That's so perfect.
So thank you all for joining us online. Those of you who are watching this afterwards, thank you for being with us. See you soon.